during our 8th International Symposium titled The New University. I am Dr. Evelyn Martinez, professor at the School of Liberal Arts and General Education at this campus. Today, Waham Gurabo, the Library Museum Governor Dr. Pedro Rosselló, and the Association of Private Colleges and Universities of Puerto Rico are hosting this 8th symposium. The new university is faced with immense and fascinating challenges that require different ways to provide knowledge. Higher education has a responsibility to provide an education that consistently exceeds this generation's expectations and must find ways to keep it motivated and focused on its educational journey. The university's task will be to merge a diversity of generations that includes students, academic administrators, and faculty members. Through this symposium, we look forward to initiating dialogues that will lead to the development of novel ideas to address the new university. Waham Gurabo warmly welcomes Mr. Jose F. Mendez, President of the Ana G. Mendez University System. Mr. Mendez, please. Presidents and officials of universities in Puerto Rico, please stand up. Thank you. Thank you. Government officials of Puerto Rico, please stand up. Dr. Pedro Rosselló, former governor of Puerto Rico. The Library Governor Museum Pedro Rosselló board members, please stand up. We are very honored to welcome our distinguished speaker, Dr. Michelle Wise, please. We would also like to thank our main sponsor, Banco Santander, as well as the sponsorships of Claro of Puerto Rico and Aerostar, who firmly believe that education is the tool that transforms communities. Please stand up. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. It is my pleasure to introduce our WAHAM president, Mr. Jose F. Mendez.
Buenos días, good morning. Como presidente de la Universidad Ana G. Méndez, para mí es un honor compartir con ustedes en actividades como esta. No tan solo por el tema que se discutirá en la mañana de hoy, The New University, sino por la oportunidad de ver cómo nuestra institución abre sus puertas para recibir invitados locales e internacionales para discutir los asuntos que nos afectan como país. La universidad no puede dejar de ser un espacio para discutir ideas y para proponer soluciones a los temas medulares que se discuten en diferentes sectores. No hay duda que la universidad tiene un compromiso social que va más allá de simplemente educar. Desde la academia deben continuar emergiendo las voces de la transformación que el pueblo reclama. Somos una institución vanguardista, donde el elemento de la innovación está presente en cada uno de nuestros planes de trabajo. Hemos tenido la capacidad de evolucionar rápidamente y ajustarnos a los retos que exige el mundo de hoy. Pero siempre debemos tener presente que cada paso que damos vamos construyendo la universidad que aspiramos en el futuro. Agradezco al doctor David Méndez, rector de este hermoso recinto, al gobernador doctor Pedro Rosselló y a todo el equipo de trabajo que hace este evento posible. Permítanme expresarme por un momento en inglés. Dr. Michelle R. Wise, I want to express our warmest welcome to Puerto Rico and to the 8th International Symposium. We are pleased to have you as a distinguished speaker. Deseo agradecer a todos los que componen la Asociación de Colegios y Universidades Privadas de Puerto Rico. Bienvenidos a su casa. Puerto Rico y el mundo exige que se discutan temas pertinentes a su desarrollo, que se propongan nuevas ideas y que se trabaje sin descanso hasta verlas concretadas. Hoy desde este lugar lo estamos haciendo, pero debemos provocar que más grupos en el país se unan y que desde diferentes sectores surjan los postulados de la transformación a la que el país aspira. Confío en nuestra voluntad y estoy seguro de que así será. Muchas gracias a todos y buenos días.
I would like to introduce Dr. Obed Jimenez, President of the Association of Colleges and Universities of Puerto Rico. He will be addressing you in Spanish. Dr. Obed?
Buenos días a todos. Me uno al saludo protocolar esta mañana. Presidente José F. Méndez, presidente de la universidad, la nueva Universidad Ana G. Méndez. Rector Méndez también, rector de este hermoso e icónico campus universitario. De verdad que es hermoso. Presidente Haddock, presidente de la Universidad de Puerto Rico, exgobernador Pedro Rosselló, un placer. Dr. Michelle Wiseman, welcome to Puerto Rico and welcome to this beautiful campus. I will be a little bit disruptive. I'll be talking in Spanish. Como bien ustedes conocen, ACUP es reconocida como la más prestigiosa asociación de instituciones de educación superior privadas establecidas en Puerto Rico sin fines de lucro, todas acreditadas por la Middle States Commission of Higher Education y cuenta con una matrícula de aproximadamente 112.193 estudiantes de los 154.471 en instituciones de educación superior privadas en Puerto Rico. Nuestra asociación agrupa 13 de las principales instituciones de educación superior de Puerto Rico. Les envían un saludo cordial mis colegas, presidentes de nuestras instituciones miembros, algunos de ellos que por asuntos ajenos a su voluntad no pueden estar aquí presentes. Las instituciones miembros EDP University, American University, Caribbean University, Centro de Estudios Avanzados de Puerto Rico y del Caribe, Pontificia Universidad Católica, Universidad Ana G. Méndez, Universidad Central de Bayamón, Universidad Carlos Albizu, Universidad Central del Caribe, Universidad Interamericana, Universidad Politécnica, Universidad Sagrado Corazón y Universidad Adventista de las Antillas. ACUP se estableció en el 1984, hace ya 35 años, como una iniciativa de los presidentes de los colegios y universidades privadas ante el reto de unir esfuerzos para dar a conocer la gestión que se realiza y realizar un impacto en el desarrollo y bienestar de la sociedad puertorriqueña. La misión de ACUP es fomentar el desarrollo de la educación superior privada a su máxima expresión. ACUP ha tenido participación activa en el análisis de diversos proyectos ante la Legislatura de Puerto Rico, el Departamento de Educación y el Consejo de Educación de Puerto Rico, ahora la Junta de Instituciones Postsecundarias de Puerto Rico. Entre otros, además de colaborar con el Hispanic Association of Colleges and Universities y la National Association of Independent Colleges and Universities, NAICU, en relación a los temas de política pública en Washington, D.C. Además, ha establecido organizaciones públicas y privadas para establecer la creciente demanda de profesionalización de los recursos humanos que requiere la reestructuración de la educación tradicional y la prestación de servicios especializados de manera coordinada y no tradicional. Hemos aunado esfuerzos entre ACUP y la Universidad Ana G. Méndez, recinto de Gurabo, para presentar hoy el 8º Simposio Internacional de la Biblioteca Museo Gobernador Pedro Rosselló sobre la nueva universidad y de esta forma continuar desarrollando un plan de acción con visión y liderato, logrando un análisis reflexivo y de consenso ante los retos que enfrenta la educación de Puerto Rico. El tema principal de este simposio aborda el concepto de la innovación disruptiva para generar cambios importantes y determinantes en la educación superior y así promover la universidad del futuro. Con la aportación de ideas y recomendaciones, este simposio representa otro continuo compromiso con la educación para promover mayores oportunidades de acceso a nuestros estudiantes a una educación óptima y de calidad. Es muy importante que la educación ocupe un lugar fundamental en el mejoramiento de la calidad de vida de la sociedad puertorriqueña. Para construir un mejor país, necesitamos de ciudadanos que posean una educación sólida, de la mejor calidad, producto de su formación en las instituciones de educación superior. Por lo tanto, es importante destacar que nuestros proyectos deben siempre llevarse a cabo según nuestro postulado, nuestros estudiantes, nuestra razón de ser. Reafirmamos que las instituciones de educación superior existen para servir y fortalecer a la sociedad de la cual formamos parte, a través del aprendizaje, la enseñanza y la investigación, además del compromiso de estudiantes, docentes y personal administrativo, se construye el capital social para contribuir positivamente a la sociedad. Este simposio brindará el espacio necesario para aportar a la evolución de la educación de Puerto Rico. A nombre de ACUP, le ofrecemos una cordial bienvenida a este simposio y esperamos que disfruten del mismo y que seamos disruptivos, innovadoramente hablando, de ahora en adelante. Que pasen un feliz día.
Please welcome Please welcome Dr. Pedro Rosselló, who will briefly provide an overview of today's topic and introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Michelle Wise. I'm so sorry. I'm sorry.
That's okay, it happens to me all the time. Bienvenidos todos, muy buenos días. Welcome all to this symposium. And I wish to welcome this gathering of presidents, chancellors, deans, professors, and in general leaders of higher education in Puerto Rico. And special welcome to all our students also who join us in this symposium, which after all has been organized for their benefits and those that will follow them. Technical problems. No cambia aquí. Okay. There you go. Okay, thank you. We're talking about technology, and this is the person that least knows about technology, so. Free college for all qualified students. Courses available anytime, anywhere. Programs and degrees available from the best universities on earth. Is this a utopia? Until recently, education as a lifelong fundamental human right, from preschool to postgraduate, was only a noble aspiration. And the typical questions surrounding this ideal would always come up. How would it be implemented? Would there be enough resources available? What structure could make it possible? Today, I think we have the answer: technology. Considering Puerto Rico's recent history with natural disasters and with an unprecedented fiscal challenge, our universities are focused on present-day affairs and are naturally inclined to return to how things used to be, to go back to a reality that no longer exists. It is no longer enough to rebuild and reestablish the same institutions. We need to imagine the future, rethink it, and aspire to something greater. And this must all take place within the framework of a globalized world in which we live, mired in exponential innovations in science and technology, in new discoveries as to our understanding of the universe and indeed human nature itself. We are experimenting fantastic systemic transformations in every economic and social sector, in essential utilities like power and water, in transportation and housing, in health and functional longevity, in artificial intelligence and robotics, to which we can add the disappearance of traditional jobs and an increase in available leisure time, among other socioeconomic areas. These drastic transformations are warning us that the university of tomorrow will be radically different than it is today, both quantitatively and qualitatively. Today, we're fortunate to have Dr. Weiss, who will be addressing you shortly, a renowned researcher and expert in disruptive changes in higher education, who will address us today on the disruptive effects of these technologies that are being developed. And it is through this lens of technology and its disruptions that we must imagine, not properly predict the future, but imagine what higher education in Puerto Rico can and will be like in a decade. Earlier in the 1960s, President John F. Kennedy called upon the nation to confront the challenges of space and reach the moon within a decade.
Why, some say, the moon? Why choose this as our goal? And they may well ask, why climb the highest mountain? Why, 35 years ago, fly the Atlantic? Why does Rice play Texas? We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win, and the others too.
And so, let's this be our moonshot now. So again, we must ask, is this a utopia? The truth is that we already have the technological wherewithal to start steering our universities towards the future. Why not start this inevitably transformation in our island today? I submit not only that we can, but that we need to do it urgently. The future starts today. Thank you very much.
It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Michelle Weiss.
Good morning, everyone. Sorry for the pause there. I'm absolutely delighted to be here. Thank you all so much for the kind invitation and for your participation in this event. It's really exciting to see the way in which you talk about higher education, because generally when I'm brought into situations like these, not everyone is kind of on board with the idea of a radical transformation of higher education. So it's great to know that many of you are already in this mindset, thinking about the future. I lead an Institute for the Future of Work at Strata Education Network, and the idea is that we just want to get smarter about all these different kinds of projections about the future of work in order to understand how learning then has to transform to meet the needs of the workforce of 2030 or 2040. And we believe very concretely in this idea of a learning ecosystem of the future, which I will go into in a little moment today. I thought I would just tell you just a tiny bit about my background, just because it's relevant to the discussion we're having here. I've sort of built a career in change and innovation within higher education, and it wasn't necessarily intentional, but just through my work, especially with Clayton Christensen, I've been brought into multiple contexts to think about how to drive change and innovation within universities, and also from the periphery as well. And what I've found is that when you talk about change and transformation and innovation in colleges and universities, I'm often not the most popular person in the room. And this is partly, I used to kind of take it more personally, but now I've realized actually it's actually an innate tendency. It's built into our brain's limbic system, and it has a whole lot to do with that little almond-shaped piece of our brain called the amygdala. And what is interesting about the amygdala is this tiny sliver within our brain has really helped us stay alive since the age of the Neanderthals. When we could kind of recognize the sound of a tiger in the bush, we had this immediate heightened sense of alert, and we knew whether we should try to run or fight or flight. And the challenge is now those same instincts are the same sorts of ways in which we react to change and newness. We actually perceive them as danger, as if it were a tiger in the bush, even though it's actually potentially more of a probabilistic threat. But our brain doesn't know how to make any sense of that change. So what happens when our amygdala goes on high alert is that it actually prevents our prefrontal cortex from combating all of our biases towards negativity. So many of you probably have encountered this same situation where you bring up a really great idea in a meeting, and for some reason there's this impulse to kill it, right? You might have a wonderful idea, and you notice that people in the room are really just wanting that idea to go away. And part of this is because of this phenomenon that kind of triggers our biases towards negativity. And the hard part is it's not like we can just sort of say, well, let's just orient more towards the future. Let's try to just think 10 years out from now. It actually turns out that our brains are unable to project 10 years out. We actually can't even imagine our own selves 10 years out from now. What they've done is they've done some fMRI studies of our brains, and they've seen that actually this part of our brain, the medial prefrontal cortex, actually almost dims down. The neural patterns, if someone says, what do you want to be 10 years from now? Our neural patterns actually dim down as though we're looking at a complete stranger, even though it is us. And so it's one of the reasons why we're so terrible at financial planning, or stopping cigarette smoking, or stopping, how much we eat or drink. It's because it's really hard to care about that future self when that person seems like a complete stranger. So, how do we think bigger? How do we orient ourselves better towards the future? This is where I have found my experience with learning more about the theories of disruptive innovation extremely helpful. So as many of you know, this is Clayton Christensen. He is a Harvard Business School professor. He is the godfather of the theories of disruption, very closely related to Schumpeter's creative destruction idea. But essentially, when in the late 90s, as Clay was pursuing his doctoral degree in business, and he had actually worked for a long time in industry, and he was trying to just understand why is it that some of the most amazing organizations succumbed to what seemed like these marginal entrants in the market. What was it that made it so difficult for some of our largest, most successful companies to sustain success? And the theory he came up with was this very simple one, which is simply that there's a process through which something emerges on the low end of the market and gradually improves over time to upend the incumbent organization. And it's really important for many of us to just sort of understand very concretely some of these very specific markers of disruption. Because what happens when you talk about disruption is that a lot of people tend to use it very freely. They'll see a new technology, they'll see something that seems like a breakthrough technology, and they'll say, I think that's disruptive. But it turns out that technology alone is actually not a disruptor. And so I thought it might be helpful first to just start with some common definitions so that as you are all engaged in looking at different things emerging on the market, that you will be able to better have a very sharp lens on how you consider the different kinds of innovations emerging. So 3 things I want you to keep in mind, and if there's 3 things that you can remember after this talk, I hope they are these 3 items. The most important pieces of disruption focus on this idea of non-consumers, which I will go into in a second, this idea of the job to be done, and just thinking more concretely about business model innovation. So those are the 3 things that I hope that we will kind of consistently sort of reemphasize throughout this talk. So the best way to think about disruption is to imagine any sort of industry as a set of concentric circles. And imagine that that centermost circle is the people who have the most amount of wealth and the most amount of skills. And the larger circles are larger populations of people who have fewer skills and less money. Generally what happens is that any sort of product or service generally starts in that middlemost circle, because generally when you're creating something new, they often tend to be more complicated and expensive, and so the first people who can actually adopt those tools are the ones in that centermost circle. And so if you think about just the simple sort of market in the context of that circle, and you think about the general trajectory of improvement over time, you have actually 2 sorts of trajectories. One is this notion that you're just going to build better products and services over time, right? And some of those might be sort of small incremental improvements to that product or service. And then sometimes they will be more dramatic breakthrough innovations in that product. And what happens is, though, there's always going to be a second trajectory as we think about the performance of a product or service over time. And that is signified by this red line. The red line is basically our ability to absorb all of that improvement over time. And so if you think about where the red is on top of the blue in this diagram, one way to think about it is the way in which personal computers first emerged on the market. If you think about something like in the early 80s of the Intel 286, the computers were so unsophisticated that they could kind of barely keep pace with someone's ability to do just basic word processing, right? You would type, and then you would see the words kind of catch up to what you were actually typing. Where the blue is over the red is if you think about the kinds of devices you're all carrying today, in your phone, in your phones, in your tablets, in your laptops, we can now pretty much only absorb a small fraction of what those processors have to offer. When we think about the laptop, our laptops and the power within, we're probably only leveraging maybe 15% of what those processors actually have to offer. And so that is what we mean by our ability to absorb all these different sorts of improvements over time. And in general, what happens is that most businesses and most organizations will want to stay in that middlemost circle and produce better products and services over time. What a disruptive innovation is an entrant that comes on that low end of the market. And they are something that create something new and often less expensive and more accessible to a whole new population of people. And these are people for whom the alternative is nothing at all. And that's why we call them non-consumers. It's the people for whom there is really nothing at all. And this is how disruptive entrants actually gain traction in the market. They don't try to compete directly with those in the centermost circle, but they start with those folks who have fewer demands and fewer ideas of what good is. So one way to think about it is when Apple started to first create their personal computers, they did not go after the same customers who were buying mini computers, the computer the size of a podium. They went after hobbyists. They went after children who had nothing else to compare that very crummy computer to. So they were absolutely delighted by the quality of this very sad little computer because they were not going after the ones who were using the mini computer for much higher level kinds of tasks. So the first thing that we have to think about is, are we actually serving and targeting people who are non-consumers or overserved by existing products? So another way to think about this is the way in which the transistor technology emerged, starting in 1947. When Bell Labs introduced the transistor technology, it was something that was kind of perfect for inserting into a hearing aid. When Sony first started to develop this to leverage the transistor radio, to leverage the transistor technology into a portable radio, the transistor radio, they were not going after competing with those who had vacuum tube technology at the time. Vacuum tube technology was sort of the technology of the time. RCA was the leading company kind of doing this work, and they were all kind of building those tabletop sorts of radios, right? Those huge machines and these huge TVs. Transistor radios first emerged, and the non-consumers, the people for whom the alternative was nothing at all, were young teenagers. Teenagers were delighted by this very unsophisticated radio. It was just good enough for them to leverage it outside of the house. They could escape the view of their parents, and they could listen to rock music. It was absolutely wonderful, right? What RCA didn't necessarily understand was that Sony would improve that technology over time and start inserting it into small, portable black and white TVs. And when people looked at, again, that just sort of just good enough quality of that black and white TV, people with the larger vacuum tube technology powered TVs looked at that transistor TV and said, why would anyone want that? The people for whom the alternative was nothing at all were those who lived in small apartments, who couldn't afford to have a huge radio, a tabletop radio. They didn't have the space for it. So these smaller technologies around black and white televisions ultimately enabled these consumers to get more used to these improving products over time. And what ended up happening is that Sony actually upended RCA as the leader in this field. Same thing happened with the, oh, I lost my picture, with the introduction of the Toyota Corona. Not the Corolla, but the Corona. The Corona emerged as a very low-end piece of machinery in the 50s. And what people didn't really understand was who would actually want this car that easily rusted, that seemed to break down a lot. The people who really wanted this kind of technology were the people who were walking. They were using the bus. They were absolutely delighted by the quality of this crummy car because their alternative was nothing at all. And again, what GM, what Ford, but the big three in Detroit did not understand as they were producing nicer and faster and better performing Cadillacs and nicer cars is that Toyota would actually improve to the Camry, to the Avalon, to actually the Lexus luxury brand of vehicles to ultimately upend the auto industry. And what's important to remember also with these stories about the processes of disruption is that they are in fact processes. That's not a certain moment where disruption occurs. It takes sometimes many decades for this process to take place. So here's where we come to this idea of, is this innovation not actually as good enough as existing offerings in the market? This is a really important thing for us to understand, because as we try to translate this idea of the non-consumer, or this idea of something being just good enough in higher education, it helps for us to understand kind of, again, that sort of impulse to squash or that impulse to scorn something new. In the early 90s, when online technologies just started to become sophisticated enough to use as a classroom tool, things like University of Phoenix, DeVry University started to emerge in the market. Now, over time, what happened is these sorts of for-profit universities really started to game the system and move into a different kind of a way of thinking about the market and became quite predatory in their practices. But when they first emerged, what was kind of revolutionary about the idea of a University of Phoenix is that it really catered to these non-consumers. These were people who could not afford to leave their jobs. The opportunity costs were just too high. So the flexibility of being able to go to something at night, right off of the freeway. It was quite incredible. And to be able to do some of this stuff asynchronously online, it was quite revolutionary. It was so much so that the first learners who actually leveraged online education were willing to pay a huge premium for these sorts of courses. They were paying up to $500 or $600 per credit hour because of the value of that flexibility and that convenience. Over time, we've seen kind of waves of disruption, where we've seen the prices drop, the technologies advance, and now we're seeing the emergence of things like competency-based education or mastery-based education. So, is it really, just good enough that we can kind of identify, I can kind of project and extrapolate how this maybe might improve over time? The next piece is there some sort of technology enabler that allows a company to kind of take that low-cost value proposition up market? And this is where it's really important to understand that a technology alone is not disruptive. A technology is an enabler for disruption. So one way to think about this is to think about the hotel industry. Up until the emergence of something like Airbnb, the hotel industry has remained somewhat immune to disruption, partly because there hasn't been an excellent sort of online technological enabler to help someone like a Motel 6 move up market and try to compete with a Four Seasons or a Ritz-Carlton. As we think about who resides in that centermost circle, those are some of those elite brands, right? And it's pretty much impossible for us to imagine a motel, or a Holiday Garden Inn or some sort of lower-end company trying to compete with a Ritz-Carlton, right? Because in order to do that, it would basically have to replicate all of the fixed costs of a Four Seasons. It would have to invest in better rooms. It would have to have a nicer pool. It would have to have stronger concierge services, right? It would have to basically completely replicate the cost model of one of those organizations that reside in that centermost circle. And then finally, is that technology actually paired with some sort of business model innovation that allows it to be sustainable? And here's where the profound sort of takeaway of the theories of disruption comes. Because as we think about business model innovation, we're also going to understand that there is this thing called asymmetric motivation, that the folks in that centermost circle see a disruptive entrant kind of coming into the low end of the market, and they are motivated to actually flee that low end of the market. And here's what I mean. So in the 70s and 80s, Digital Equipment Corporation was sort of at the height of, they were just, at the peak of their work. And, a lot of business analysts kind of looked at what Digital Equipment Corporation, and they said, these people have the smartest teams, they have the best managers, this is why they are so excellent in the field. And they were producing, these incredible mini computers. So if you think about mainframe computers taking up an entire room, that mini computer was a new sort of solution that was just as powerful, smaller, and quite innovative. The fascinating thing is, as Digital Equipment Corporation sort of saw the entrance of these smaller personal computers on the market, they actually asked their existing customers, do you want us to build you a personal computer? And their customers said, no, we have absolutely no need for that smaller, less useful computer. Build me a faster, better performing mini computer. And when they actually looked at the financial outlook of what it would take to kind of do that work, it was kind of delightful, because as they thought about going on that sustaining trajectory and building better products and services over time, the margins were enormous. They were close to $100,000 per unit. When they looked at the personal computer market, they knew something was happening. It wasn't that they were unaware that there was some sort of new innovation on the market. But when they looked at the margins were paltry. They were close to $1,000 a unit versus $100,000 per unit, right? So they were motivated to flee that low end of the market. They were absolutely delighted to kind of say, go ahead, take over those personal computers. We're going to make better performing, much more profitable mini computers. So this is what we mean by asymmetric motivation. You're actually motivated to flee that part of the market, and this is the core of what Clayton Christensen calls the Innovators Dilemma, is that it makes no customer sense, it makes no financial sense to pursue that low end of the market, which is why incumbents tend to kind of stay on that sustaining trajectory versus trying to explore that more disruptive offering. So again, we talked about non-consumers. Now we want to talk about this core idea of the job to be done. And we're going to translate this. We're going to translate these 3 items into the language of higher ed. Because I know I've been talking a lot about business and business models. Let's talk about higher education. So as we think about non-consumers of higher education, who are the non-consumers of higher education? We are seeing a dramatic shift in our education consuming population. If you think about the target population of our upcoming learners in the Gen Z population, they are a much smaller proportion of the population. We actually now have the idea of a non-traditional learner, someone that we often sort of see as an adult learner, we'll call them a non-traditional student. That notion of a non-traditional learner is just out of date because most learners now are non-traditional. What we mean is that over 70% of them show some sort of characteristic that identifies them as that sort of that new traditional student. And what that means is that they are often working part-time. They are often working full-time. They are caregivers, they have children, they have families, they have geographic ties to a region, and they have a lot of other stuff that gets in the way of their pursuit of a degree. So they may not be as interested in the sorts of bundled services that a university tends to provide. We also know that their needs and demands are changing. We've actually been interviewing at my organization 350 people every single day for the last 3 years. We have a repository of about 300,000 interviews with Americans. And what we've asked them is, why are they pursuing higher education? Why are they actually enrolling? And over and over and over again, what they tell us is that the reason why they are pursuing higher education is to get a good job or to get a better job. Double more than any other motivation out there, this is the reason why they are pursuing higher education. And it's interesting because there's clearly changes that they see afoot. And this is something that was actually signaled by McKinsey analysts a couple of years ago, where they actually measured the number of skill sets that were demanded in the workforce, and within a less than 3-year period, the number of skill sets jumped up from 178 to 924. And that was back in 2012, so we can only extrapolate from there how many more skill sets might be in demand in the workforce of now. We also know that we have a whole millions and millions and millions of learners out there who could potentially advance their earnings if they were to pursue some sort of post-secondary credential. There are approximately 83 million Americans with a high school degree and or some college. So there is really an opportunity to think about these non-consumers of higher education. And as we think again about that need for a good or a better job, we have to think about this concept that Clay talks about called the jobs to be done. And it's a very simple idea. It's that we don't actually buy products or services like we think we do. We actually hire them to do a job in our lives. So one way to think about this is the great marketing professor Theodore Levitt once said that we don't actually want to buy a 1/4-inch drill. We want a 1/4-inch hole, right? And so we will hire different sorts of products and services to get us that hole, but we are looking for a certain job to be done. And so if we kind of translate this idea, one really interesting corollary to this concept of the jobs to be done is thinking about the newspaper industry, right? Newspaper industry actually has a lot in common with higher education. The newspaper industry, as we think about its collapse, prior to that collapse, We used to hire a newspaper to do many different jobs for us in our lives. We used to hire a newspaper to keep us abreast of global news or local news, right? We used to hire a newspaper to help us find real estate, or maybe to find a car, or maybe to find a partner, right? We used to hire a newspaper to keep us from getting bored, right? We do the crossword puzzle or Sudoku. We hired a newspaper for many different jobs. And what happened is that job by job, piece by piece, newspapers were undone by places like Craigslist, Google, blogs, CNN.com, LinkedIn, right? Job by job, these different organizations came up and went for one of those single value propositions instead of trying to offer numerous jobs to be done for all different kinds of people. Same thing goes for higher education. We now offer a lot of different services, a whole array of degree programs for many different kinds of learners, but we really need to understand what is it that they are hiring higher education to do in their lives. And it turns out, again, back to this notion of getting a good or a better job. We've actually interviewed, again, out of that slew of about 300,000 learners, from our currently enrolled students, we found that only 40% actually feel like their liberal arts major might lead to a good job. So are we performing? Probably not. And it turns out that these learners, these 40%, actually are on to something, or the 60% are actually on to something. We did some research last year where we looked at a sample of 4 million unique resumes. And we were trying to understand this idea of underemployment. You've probably heard of this idea, you know, I have a son or a daughter who just graduated from college, but for some reason they're working at Target now, right? Why isn't that they are able to find their footing? Why aren't they launching into good careers? And it's this idea of underemployment. Are our learners actually going into jobs that don't really require a college credential? And there tends to be this story or this narrative when you read the newspaper or when you watch different sorts of stories that this is just a short-term problem. They will find their footing soon. 20 years from now, this will just be a small blip on their radar. Well, what we did when we analyzed these 4 million unique resumes over a longitudinal kind of 10-year period is that we found that strikingly about 43% of learners started off underemployed, meaning that they were in a job that really didn't require a college credential. That in itself wasn't that startling. It kind of corresponds with different sorts of rates coming out of the Fed and other sorts of analyses. What was really striking, however, is that if you started off underemployed in your first job, you were 5 times more likely to remain underemployed 5 years later. 75% of that population in that 5-year bucket who were underemployed remained underemployed 10 years later. So underemployment is not a short-term problem. It can be a permanent detour with some severe consequences. And what we realized is that underemployment actually matters if you are a woman or a man. What was really striking is that more women were often starting out underemployed versus men. Whereas 1 in 3 men started off underemployed, 1 in 2 women started off underemployed. And it didn't matter what the women majored in. For men, if they actually majored in computer science and engineering and even communications, they were more likely to escape the rut of underemployment a little bit more quickly. For women, it didn't matter what they majored in. They were more likely to start off underemployed, and they were less likely to actually escape that rut of underemployment. Even if a woman was studying math or computer science, it didn't matter. The only exception was engineering, where women were equally less likely to be underemployed their first year out. And you have to think about the financial costs of that underemployment, right? Because if you are not appropriately employed in something that actually requires that college credential, you could be earning on average $10,000 less per year. Think about how that might accumulate or compound over a 5 or a 10-year period. And it's not even just those financial implications, it's the loss of access to professional networks, to social capital, to all the sorts of things you could be building as you are pursuing your career. So it turns out that our learners are really onto something in terms of trying to understand how do they connect that idea of learning to know, knowledge base, to the application of their knowledge in the labor market. Today, underemployment, the skills gap in the United States has really created this idea of a new job to be done in higher education. It really became striking many years ago when Gallup came out with 2 different surveys. And one was that 96% of chief academic officers believe that they are preparing learners well for the workforce. Only 11% of business leaders actually agree. That disconnect is really vast, right? And so as employers have become much more vocal about their dissatisfaction with the level of their degree candidates, a lot of learners are starting to become slightly savvier shoppers of higher education. They are learning that they need to hire higher education to do something more specific in their lives. They may be looking for a more streamlined, targeted, briefer program that moves them ahead in their working lives. And we have a job to be done, and we may not be fulfilling it for most of our learners. And again, it's not that we are somehow incapable of understanding what our learners need. You know, we see these sorts of coding boot camps coming on the periphery, right? We see these developments of different kinds of alternative learning providers emerging on the margins, so we are aware that things are happening. It's not that we are completely unaware. Just the same as Digital Equipment Corporation was aware that something was happening with personal computers, they just didn't know how to respond. And part of that is because the business model often gets in the way. And people get really concerned when I talk about the business model of higher education or the economics of higher education. But in truth, every single university has some sort of revenue model that they have to generate in order to just exist. And that's why we talk about the business model of higher education. And what happens is that most institutions, most colleges and universities can't help but create sustaining innovations over disruptive innovations. And the reason why is when we actually come up with a value proposition, like teaching in a small college setting, if that's our value proposition, we put into play lots of different sorts of resources and processes to make that happen, whether it's the capital expenditure of making small labs or small classrooms or investing in teachers. For processes, it might be recruiting processes, tenure promotion processes. We put into play lots of different activities in order to start iterating and creating some sort of revenue model. It is so difficult to actually create a positive revenue model that once we actually land on it, what happens is that locks us into place. It locks us in terms of what we can actually, it starts to dictate what value proposition we can actually deliver. And so what happens is, as we see some sort of innovative solution emerging on the market, we can't help but sort of either ruin it if we try to bring it into our existing model, or turn it into something else because we will try to make it work within that existing model. To further complicate things, as we think about our traditional brick and mortar colleges and universities, we don't just have one business model, we have 3 business models at least, right? We have a solution shop model, we have a value-adding process business activity, and we have facilitated networks that we try to create. So one way to think about this is we have research, right? We have teaching, and then we have the social growth of our learners. What those are 3 fundamentally conflicting and different business models that we try to wrap under the auspices of a single brick and mortar university. So it's as though we were trying to connect and mash up a McKinsey & Company with a Jiffy Lube. Do you guys know what Jiffy Lube is? Okay, good. and Facebook. Those are 3 fundamentally different business models that we are trying to make work within an organization. So it actually looks a little bit more like this, right? And it's a whole lot more complicated than this because as we think about the resources bucket, right, as we think about professors as a fundamental resource, they are in all 3. So the spaghetti noodles kind of go across all 3 of these business models. And what's unique is that faculty are also a locus of control. Unlike in other sorts of business models, we have something called governance, right? Shared governance and faculty, which further complicates this trying to coordinate or orchestrate 3 different business models. I actually gave this talk, and a Stanford professor came up to me and said, or a provost, Stanford provost came up to me and said, we don't have 3 of these, we have 17 business models that we are, because they have a hospital, right? They have land, they have other sorts of things that they are trying to integrate. And it's for these reasons that it is so difficult to actually disrupt from within. Only a very few number of companies, even just private companies in the, have actually been able, or industry examples have actually been able to do this, because it requires a whole new set of resources and processes to actually facilitate that new business model. So I'll just name just a few examples of companies that have been able to try to create these sorts of, or foster disruptive growth units within their organizations. One is, as we think about, again, where digital equipment was in the early 80s, they were at the height, they were at the apex of their growth. In '88, everything fell off a cliff. It wasn't just Digital Equipment Corporation, it was Wang, it was Hewlett. A bunch of mini computer companies just collapsed. And part of it, the only reason why IBM was not one of those companies was because they actually tried to create and foster that disruptive unit within. What they did was they had a mainframe computing business in New York. They had a mini computer business in Minnesota. And as they saw personal computers start to emerge in the market, they actually set up a totally different business unit in Florida. And they created a skunkworks team, a tiger team, some unit that was actually told and mandated, do not try to figure out how you make personal computers work in the mini computing business model. Figure out a separate business model, whether it means low overhead, low margin, high volume. You guys figure it out. And that was critical, because when Digital Equipment Corporation tried to figure out a business model for personal computers, the only way it made sense within their existing mini computer business model was to sell a personal computer for $50,000 per unit, when they were in fact selling for $2,000 per unit, right? So it didn't make any economic sense. But when IBM was able to strike out that separate autonomous unit, they were able to sort of foster something that could potentially cannibalize their existing business. Same thing happened for Dayton Hudson. Dayton Hudson is actually the creator of Target retailers. They used to be more of that high-end mall, high-end retailer, and then they created their low-end retailer of Target, which has been enormously successful. We've also seen this with Intel, where they've created their separate Celeron microprocessor to try to capture the lower end of the market. They've done that quite well. Same with Charles Schwab, where they've actually separated their online brokerage from their telephone-based and office-based brokerages. We've also seen it with the way in which Hewlett-Packard has been able to separate their inkjet and laserjet businesses. But the actual examples are very few and far between. Now, that's a little bit depressing, right? We have to then try to think about, okay, we know that these are how, this is the way in which we can start to conceive of disruptive innovation in higher education. But it's not just this problem that we are dealing with. We are dealing with exponential futures at this moment, right? None of us can kind of look at what is going on in our lives and deny that technology is just changing the way we live and work, right? And we see the way in which we are starting to feel the velocity of technological change. And part of this is because of Moore's Law. And many of you are familiar with Moore's Law, which is just simply that the rate of computing power doubles every 2 years or every 18 months. And we've actually seen this manifest over time. We've actually seen a trillion-fold increase in computing power since the 1890s. And a billion-fold of that increase just occurred since the creation of mainframe computers. And it's not just that the computing power increases, it's that prices tend to fall. So what happens is that you lead to faster and more market penetration. So an example, it took about 76 years for the analog telephone to actually reach half of the US population. It took 76 years. The mobile phone has now hit 76% of our global population in less than 10 years, right? So that's another example. One of my favorites is, as we think about the prices of technology starting to fall, is PricewaterhouseCoopers actually came up with this notion that in 2001, it used to cost $96 million to sequence a human genome. In 2013, that price fell to $6,000. And now, any one of us can go online and pay $20 and get a 23andMe kit and actually do some of that same work. So this is what people talk about and mean when they're talking about exponential futures. And exponential futures are no joke. And then we think about all these projections about automation and artificial intelligence and machine learning, right? There are now projections that anywhere from 8 to 47% of the US workforce is at risk of automation. McKinsey analysts believe that half of the activities affiliated with $15 trillion in the global economy are also at risk of obsolescence because of automation and computerization. Right? So what do we do with that? How do we actually start preparing for that future of work? This is one of my favorite quotes from a futurist at University of Hawaii, Manoa, named Jim Dater. And he says, any useful statement about the future should at first seem ridiculous. Right? So one way to think about it is, if someone told you 10 years ago that you're going to get into the car of a stranger, and maybe it's their personal car, and then that person might take you to the airport, and then you're going to leave and not actually exchange any money right there. It just sounded ridiculous, right? But now this is actually, if you think about Uber and Lyft, this has actually become one of our main modes of transportation. Same way as we think about Airbnb, Alibaba, et cetera. So here's something ridiculous for you. There are now futurists and experts on aging and longevity who are saying that the first people to live to be 150 years old have already been born. How frightening is that, right? Does that mean we're going to work 80 or 100 years, right? Suddenly, as we use that sort of animating question of an 80 or a 100-year work life, it suddenly seems deeply inadequate for us to think that 2, 4, or 6 years of higher education on the front end of that longer life makes sense, right? We are going to have to start to prepare learners for jobs that do not exist yet. And we've already started this. LinkedIn in 2014 told us that the top 10 jobs that were posted on LinkedIn by those who held them were jobs that just really didn't exist 5 or 10 years prior. These were jobs like UI, UX designer, iOS or Android developer, cloud manager, big data architect, social media intern. These were roles that just didn't exist, and yet these were the top and hottest jobs on LinkedIn. So as we think about this idea of a potentially longer and more turbulent work life, we have to stop thinking about higher education as some sort of linear trajectory that kind of is, and we can't continue to think of our lives as taking this sort of three-part shape where you have education, work, retirement, right? Our lives, if they are longer and potentially more turbulent, are going to implicate that we will probably have to transition many times over that longer work life. We've already had to. When we've actually looked at the Bureau of Labor Statistics, early baby boomers, by the time they retire, already have experienced 12 different jobs over the course of their career. If you think about the job hopping tendencies of millennials, who sometimes are having about 7 different jobs by the time they're 25, how many different kinds of careers might they have over that 80 or 100-year work life, right? So we're going to have to stop thinking about education as linear and more like a series of highways where we need to build more on and off ramps between education and work. We are going to have to harness the power of education throughout our working lives. It's not a one and done experience on the early side of our lives. And we're also going to have to think about how we attend to adult learners better through this model, right? As we think about the current demands on that sort of non-traditional learner, when they are taking care of an elderly person in their family or their children, or they're trying to manage multiple part-time or full-time jobs in order to make ends meet, how can we then ask them to layer on education on top of all of that, right? How do we begin to think about education as a more seamless movement in and out of learning and work? We are going to have to think about how we also tie more directly that education to economic relevance. So we're going to have to think about new models. As we think about kind of looping in and out of learning, we're going to have to think about how will that person, how will someone who maybe is a 45-year-old truck driver who sees that their job might be becoming obsolete, take a look at themselves and understand what kinds of skills and abilities do I actually have that translate into another field. They're going to need to be able to turn to someone. They're going to need some sort of trusted advisor that they turn to ask for help. So we are going to need to think about how we maybe serve as that kind of source of good information. We're going to then have to figure out how do we understand where that person is in terms of their skills and knowledge and abilities, right? If we take someone who is 45 or 55 years old, they have lots of work experience. They have lots of caregiving experience that are not necessarily captured in something like a certificate or a college credential, right? We don't have a good way of assessing someone's hidden skills and potential, even though they might have enormous skill, an enormous set of skills from their vast job experience. So we're going to have to figure out how we assess that person in order to then say, well, you know, did you know that 30% of your competencies actually lead you to be a good candidate to start gap filling, to fill in your gaps towards this one pathway? Or did you know that you could even think about this other pathway in product development? Or did you know that actually 60% of your competencies actually translate into this other thing that you may not have envisioned for yourself? We need to think about how we do that kind of assessment for our learners of the future. And then we're going to have to think about how we curate pathways. We are not necessarily going to build all of those programs ourselves. Again, as we think about that idea that LinkedIn had all these jobs that didn't exist 5 years prior, and you think about the academic inertia of trying to evolve quickly, we will not necessarily be able to provide all of those programs to our learners. So who do we partner with? Who are the interesting kinds of innovators in the field who are producing some of those more nimble programs? And then we're going to have to think about, okay, so then how do we give our learners that better GPS? How do we give them better information, better data? There is going to be more transparency in the market. If you think about how many reviews you read before you buy that HDMI cable or before you buy that piece of clothing, right, on Amazon or wherever you are, if you're picking out a restaurant, you'll read at least maybe 10 reviews just to make sure it's okay. That is like a $50 investment, right? There will be more transparency in this market in which we are demanding our learners to pay incredible amounts of money without being sure of what that return is. So we know that there will be a different kind of GPS mechanism or way of curating different pathways for the future. And then we're going to have to think about how do we facilitate just-in-time teaching, right? That kind of coaching. How do I stay accountable when I have so many different demands in my life? And then how do I verify that learning so that an employer understands what it is that I know I can do, right? And what this involves is a real need for something that we called competency-based education, right? Right now, as we think about our credit hour-based way of delivering education, we measure the amount of time that a butt is in a seat to understand what this part of our body actually knows, right? We're measuring the wrong end of the learner, right? But that, but that is actually how we think about education. Everything is measured in terms of time. With the introduction of something like competency-based education, time actually becomes variable, but the learning is fixed. Whereas right now, as we think about the credit hour is a fixed moment of time, and the learning can be variable, right? So what does it mean that I have a C or a D in this class versus mastering and achieving the competency to be able to do these things? I can leverage different sorts of pieces of information to create a research argument. I can synthesize multiple forms of research, et cetera. These are can-do statements. We are going to have to think much more discreetly about competency-based education because the future will have to be competency-based. Because we are not, again, going to be able to deliver 2-semester-long classes to move someone ahead in their working lives. We are going to have to think about shorter, modularized bits of learning that someone can access as they are also pursuing work. And some of those competencies are going to be what we tend to call these sorts of names, right? Soft skills, baseline skills, workforce competencies, 21st century skills. When you actually read a lot of the literature on the future of work, what people are saying is that there's just a certain number of skills that we are going to have to relinquish to the robots and the computers. Why? Because they're just going to do them better than we can, right? But there are other sorts of skills that require tacit understanding and reflection and judgment and use of values and ethics that are going to be critical to how we coordinate with those computers and robots of the future. We have to leverage our uniquely human skills, right? And these are the skills that help us transfer from domain to domain. These aren't skills that necessarily become obsolete, but they help us learn even more skills for the future. And one way to think about it is this popular concept of the T-shaped learner, right, which came out in the early 90s by the company IDEO. And the idea is that you have this broad set of knowledge. You have these broad, uniquely human skills, but that alone is not going to be enough for the future of work. It's not that we can only leverage our uniquely human skills. We are going to have this plus technical side. We're going to have this verticality of some sort of technical expertise to make ourselves more marketable in the labor market. This is a very popular idea of how we think about our learners, right? But even this concept of a T-shaped learner or thinking about human plus skills is not going to be enough for the future of work. Because again, if we think about an 80 or a 100-year work life, right, we are not going to just have one set of vertical expertise or technical expertise. We are going to have to skill up throughout our working lives. We are going to have to retool ourselves and upskill, right? And so we might have what look more like these little fangs of plus technical skills. And it's not as though we can just sort of sit still and do nothing, because already we are seeing a huge marketplace burgeon. So this is actually from a company called LearnLaunch, and actually they've revised their numbers since putting out this report. But basically, they have assessed the number of education technology companies out there that are working in workforce tech. They are thinking about informal and formal training. They're thinking about how to better match the supply of talent to the demand of opportunity. And what they have found is that we, in just the last 3 years, between 2015 and 2018, have created a $2.9 billion marketplace of workforce tech. These are all people who are tapping in to that vulnerability that we have as institutions, where learners are seeing that disconnect between the 96% believing that they are well prepared for the workforce and the 11% of business leaders agreeing. In the last 3 years, over 250 companies have been supported and backed by venture capital firms who are making bets on these guys as opposed to all of you. And what's going to happen is that institutions, colleges and universities, are going to start competing with companies they have never heard of or are less familiar with. And some people, again, that impulse to sort of scorn comes into play. And that's where, again, as we think about the lens of disruptive innovation, as soon as we say, but like General Assembly or the coding boot camps, they're kind of merging or they're getting acquired, they're not going to disrupt what I'm doing. Or no one's really going to go to something like the Minerva Project over going to a campus-based experience. What's interesting about something like the Minerva Project, which was an idea to kind of create an elite Ivy League experience for half the cost, is that people said there's no way that someone who is thinking about going to Harvard, Princeton, Yale, is going to go to something like the Minerva Project. 50% of their starting cohort were students who had actually started at one of those elite schools and decided to opt out. They were looking for something more. So again, as we start to think, yeah, that has nothing to do with what I do on my campus, or it's not good enough, again, that's where the lens of disruptive innovation can be so helpful. We cannot necessarily extrapolate from where we are today as higher education 2019 to meet the needs of the workforce of 2030 or 2040. We are going to have to engage with our learners differently than ever before. And I think the one thing we all know for sure is that we can't necessarily just stand still and think that, well, if people are saying this is the fourth industrial revolution, we've survived the three before. We'll be fine, right? Higher education endures as is. Yes, to a point, but we have to think about whether that endurance is really something that is helping our learners versus something that is more like inertia, right? And so even as we begin to say these outlandish and ridiculous stories of the future, right, and imagine these different ways of engaging our learners for the future, they're going to sound ridiculous now, but a few years from now they aren't. And so I think we can dispense with admiring the problem, and we can start building now for that learning ecosystem of the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wise, for your presentation. It has certainly been a pleasure and a privilege having you here today. We will now proceed to take questions and comments from the public. There are two available microphones on each side of this area. So please, if there are any questions, you can address Dr. Wise from any of them. Excuse me? Oh, las preguntas pueden ser en español. Yo las traduzco, okay?
Did I scare everyone?
The first question will always be the hardest. There you go.
Based on a higher education community. That's okay. Based on higher education community, and not only within the U.S. context, who do you think is at the forefront of applying the concept, the theory, in higher education? Who do you think is there now, or at least working, towards that particular line?
So the question is just who maybe is doing a good job of this work, right? So I think one of the most interesting companies is actually Western Governors University in the U.S., and it's actually an online competency-based model that has been growing approximately 30% year over year because their learners are actually wanting something that speaks to employers. What's amazing is that they don't even market. They have a 70% referral rate between their learners because an adult learner takes something, they realize how it benefits them in their work life, and they refer their friends and family to it. Again, this is a group that is serving close to 100,000 learners online. It's pretty incredible, and they're getting them into nursing programs and all sorts of licensure and others, teacher licensure programs as well. They're pretty phenomenal, and they've been kind of growing under the radar, and they are doing a really good job of thinking about mastery-based education, where it's not about time. You get a 6-month subscription period, and you can learn as much as you can in that 6-month period. What's fascinating is that it's not just for adult learners. They've actually seen the numbers of their undergraduates grow from just within a few years from about 560 younger, like 18 to 22-year-olds taking their competency-based education programs to now close to 11,000 younger college-going students. So it's pretty phenomenal. One of the other pieces of this, so not necessarily just institutional based, but as we think about the sophistication of technology over time, you know, maybe 5 years ago, everyone was really excited about virtual reality, right? And then you put on one of those headsets and you feel like you're going to vomit after about 10 minutes. Like, this is one of the challenges that they've realized, is that it gets you're so immersed, but it can often make you feel ill. And so people started to wonder, well, it's such an expensive technology. How is that actually going to be leveraged in a more widespread way? One of the companies that I listed on there, also doing some really fascinating work, is called Immersion, and they're doing virtual simulation that's AI driven, but also hybridly kind of connected with a human orchestrator on the back end. So what this looks like is, I actually did a demo where just on the computer screen, there were 5 young kids, maybe 10 years old, on the screen. And it's not like the graphics were like Fortnite kind of high resolution graphics. They're not the most incredible gaming kind of graphics, but it was just good enough, right? And I had to teach these 5 10-year-olds on the screen about the 3 branches of government. I did it for 10 minutes. I was exhausted. Because what happens is the graphics are just good enough that you can actually read these students' nonverbal cues. You can see when they kind of dip their head, kind of turn away, when their voice gets smaller or lower, and you have to react in that moment. And the Educational Testing Service is actually using this as a teacher certification pilot. They're trying to understand, how do I assess whether someone is actually a good teacher? A lot of major companies like Amazon and McKinsey are trying to use this to upskill their frontline workers in those uniquely human skills. Because how do you take someone who's 40 years old and may have, done maybe more technical training? How do you develop those uniquely human skills in their lives? You're not going to tell that person, oh, go get a 2-year liberal arts education now, right, when they're 45 years old. It may not be something that they can squeeze into their lives, right? But as we think about other ways of upskilling our learners, especially our adult learners, this is where it's kind of starting to get a little bit exciting, that the technology is starting to get better and better, that we can maybe start to think about how something like AR or VR might start to help us learn more skills for the future. Yeah. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Good morning. Thank you for your great presentation. It is inspiring.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks a lot. I am Saida Vega, and I work for Universidad Ana Jiménez at Coupé campus. And I would like to have your reflections on how to move internationalization within our university to address the future of higher ed, and for us to keep being competitive within the global community.
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously one major asset that you all have here is to develop sort of the bicultural competencies, right? And those are sort of incredibly transferable skills for the future of work, is thinking about how do we think about cultural competencies. But I think the other thing to consider is if we know that in the future we are going to need nimble thinkers, people who are agile, who can demonstrate resilience, who can adapt to changing circumstances, and who can exercise judgment in the most ambiguous of circumstances, right? That's what every employer would love, is that I can trust that this person will make a good decision even though things are changing, right? If we want to build those sorts of adept learners of the future, we have to maybe rethink the way in which we scaffold our learning today, right? As we think about all of our departmental silos, right? We have math here, we have English here, or literature here, we have anthropology here, and biology here, and physics here, right? And they all often tend to work as separate sort of fiefdoms, right? This is my thing, this is my territory. what we don't help our learners understand, and this is something that Salman Khan from Khan Academy actually talked about, is how that ultimately ghettoizes learning. It makes us believe that when we are solving a math problem, that it is only a math problem, versus everything we do in life, in work, is transdisciplinary, right? When we are talking about a physics problem, it is math. It involves chemistry. It involves anthropology, right? When we think about design thinking and the way in which we respond to problems in the real world, we have to think about how can we maybe create new incentives to collaborate more. Because right now, if you think about our tenure promotion processes or ways in which you start to earn more money over time as an instructor, you're often de-incentivized from co-teaching, right? You don't get as much credit if you collaborate on a journal article. It's not seen as your writing. But we're supposed to be teaching our learners how they can be the best sort of team workers of the future, right? That's what employers are looking for. So how do we build in that real-world problem-solving skill so that learners know that everything they do cuts across domains? I don't think we do a great job of that. It's amazing. If you ever have gotten a chance to sort of read or see the Harvard professor Eric Mazur, he talks about this really difficult problem. Actually, Stephen Kosslyn, who created the curriculum for the Minerva Project, he used to be the dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences at Harvard. And he decided he wanted to build a whole new application of knowledge because it was the same phenomenon that Eric Mazur saw, which is there's this amazing video, a documentary of MIT and Harvard engineering grads with their caps and gowns on, and they're given a battery and a light bulb. And they're told, light it, make that light bulb illuminate. Almost none of them know how to do it. These are folks who have studied physics and engineering. They don't know how to build. They don't know how to apply that learning. And that's where we have to think about how do we get more deliberate about how we think about near and far transfer of learning.
First of all, thank you very much for this excellent presentation. It's been wonderful. I'd like to make, first of all, a comment. Are we having this presentation taped or videotaped or? Yes. Yes? Okay. How can we get it? That's another question. Well, anyway.
I can also give you the slides.
Right. Okay. Thank you. I was going to ask for that. In your experience, which type of university is more in line with this development for the future? Public, state universities, or private universities, and why?
Honestly, there's a lot of innovation that I can point to across any sort of institution. There are front runners in each, whether it's a flagship, whether it's an online university, whether it's a private nonprofit, or even a private for-profit. There are sort of stellar examples in each. I think the one common theme across all of them is that they are not engaged in this useless sort of debate about college is this thing and workforce training is this other thing, that they're somehow mutually exclusive. They're actually realizing that learning and work are inseparable, and that is what commonly defines some of the innovators in the space, is that they're willing to acknowledge, again, how learners are hiring higher education to help them get a good job, right? They're not saying that the liberal arts is this and workforce training is this, and we have to keep them separate. They're figuring out how to integrate them in a way that is meaningful and brings relevance to the learner's work.
Morning, Dr. Weiss. A very challenging presentation. As you know, Puerto Rico is a very small island. We're about 3,500 square miles, 35 miles from north to south and 100 miles from east to west. In that, a small piece of real estate, we have one public institution, which is the University of Puerto Rico, with 11 campuses throughout the island. And then again, we have in a CUP about at least 10 13 private institutions. I think Puerto Rico has the largest percentage of academia, higher education per square mile. Do you think that will have some impact in the disrupted
Yep.
do you think that would have an impact on that?
So I actually, when I used to work at the Christensen Institute for Disruptive Innovation, Clay and I would actually have conversations about this. And this was actually one of his favorite topics because just a similar corollary to this. In New York, there's the State University of New York. It has about 64 campuses in the state of New York. They are all delivering 150 to 200 different degree programs each, right? If we put it in that kind of perspective, it maybe becomes a little bit clearer about how we think about a system of universities that are in a very small setting to think about what specific niche they want to fill, right? As we think about the opportunity to create a portfolio of opportunities for our learners, there may be certain jobs to be done that we relinquish to other universities and say, maybe this is where you go for these specific programs, or this is where you go for this connection to industry here, right? There are ways in which I think you can think about creating your competitive advantage so that you're not all trying to deliver every form of education to every learner out there. Because generally when people are seeking out a regional campus, it's maybe because they're tethered to that region. So how do we then begin to develop some sort of unique competitive advantage about being in that region? Who are the employers in my region? Or who are the different kinds of folks who hire my graduates? There are different ways of thinking about those connections a little bit more concretely. It's the same problem actually we have with state comprehensive universities in the U.S. In sort of the 50 states there. We have a lot of different colleges that are trying to be everything to everyone, and what ends up happening is you get this sort of one-size-fits-none phenomenon. So how do we create that sort of niche business model, that singular value proposition that is sort of uncontestable, I think is a question to think about.
This might be an unfair and maybe unanswerable question, but suppose you were the leader, the head of one of our brick and mortar universities today, and suppose you understand that change is coming. What would you do? How would you focus to address the change that you know is coming, but that would allow your institution to morph or to evolve into something that's viable in that near future, not even long-term future?
Yeah, so it's a great question. I think it really depends on who your target population is first. So again, if I'm trying to strike out and build that incredible business model for the 17 to 22-year-old learner, that is going to be a pretty specific sort of business model. As I think about the adult learners, I have to figure out how can I meet them where they are so that I'm not making them do something that makes it even more high cost and difficult to attain some sort of credential through that learning pathway. So I think it very much depends on which target population we are talking about. But I think the low-hanging fruit to me is leveraging, some of you may be familiar with the Grand Challenges Scholars Program out of the National Academies of Engineering. And it's this idea that we need more engineers in the world. We need more STEM workers for the future. But how do we actually invite more diverse students, people who are not, white male students, into engineering? And how do we get more women and diverse learners into engineering? Generally, when we've thought about engineering in the past, we tried to weed people out. How do we weed them in? And so the grand challenge is what they do is they created 20 different problems to solve for the future. Like, how do you capture solar energy more efficiently? How do you bring clean water to those who need it the most? And through that, that is then where you begin to understand the application of mathematics and different other sorts of skills and disciplines in the context of trying to solve that problem. Those are really grand challenges. It doesn't even have to be that grand and global. It can be a local challenge. And again, this is where we get to that idea of sort of de-siloing our efforts and thinking about trends and interdisciplinarity. How do we bring in real-world problems to solve for our learners that help them understand, okay, in this context, this is why I need to actually understand calculus. Nobody really understands why they need to understand calculus, right? But in the context of this particular problem that I'm trying to solve, now I understand why anthropology is so important. Now I understand why empathy is so critical, right? These other sorts of skills. So I think that is, to me, it's difficult because there are entrenched policies that keep us in this place of having very strict silos and departments. But I feel like that is where we can take that model that doesn't need to be just for engineering, but help us create more design thinkers of the future. That, I think, is just the most open and exciting opportunity to think about how we build those sorts of hybrid skills in our learners.
I have two questions. Sorry for being two, but in higher education, we talk about learning styles of students.
Yeah.
How do you envision that we can actually cater to the needs of, in an individual basis, those learning styles, maybe by technology or something? And secondly, do you see a clash between liberal arts education and these highly specialized institutions where they just want to produce a computer programmer or highly specialized professions?
Okay, so the first one, the first one was about learning styles, yes. So as I gave you that example of immersion where you're doing simulation, I think performance-based learning is going to become more core to what we do. Hands-on learning is something that we are not necessarily good at doing. Even simple things like modeling, where you teach a simple concept, take a break, let the learners actually do it, is really important. One of the most fascinating experience I had was I actually I used to live in California, and Sal Khan, who created Khan Academy, was creating a new sort of summer school for kids on teaching them robotics. And they had come up with lots of different videos and lots of different activities for the learners to do. These were like 7th graders. The learners just completely dismissed the entire curriculum and just started building. And it was in the context of building that they then sought out the YouTube video that would help them move forward and advance. That's how they were learning. So we often tend to think we know how learners learn best, but we don't, right? Because we don't observe, we don't see them modeling that behavior for us. So I think that's another sort of opportunity for us. The second question was? Liberal arts. Yes, so we actually wrote a report called Robot Ready, Human Plus Skills for the Future of Work. And it was trying to understand how we think about the skills that are desperately needed for the future. Because in one case, you have a lot of people saying there's a dearth of STEM workers. We're never gonna be okay in the future if we have these few STEM workers. On the other side, you also have a lot of people saying we shouldn't be teaching people hard skills that will wane over time. We should be teaching people how to learn for a lifetime, right? That's generally how we kind of think about liberal arts education. What we did in this project was we tried to understand the trajectory of liberal arts graduates and the kind of skills that they display in the workforce. Because generally we'll say to a liberal arts student, 20 years from now, you'll see the value of this education, right? Don't worry, you're going to catch up to the earnings of a STEM grad. What we did in this was we actually tracked millions and millions of learners through their resume and job profiles and saw where employers were hiring them, what the job postings were requiring, and what these learners were actually saying they could do on their resume, and seeing where that kind of marriage was occurring. And what's amazing is you actually see how there is actually no difference between hard and soft skills. It actually becomes this sort of hybrid thing that is this human plus technical skill, and that's why we use this phrase, because even with a term like communication, we know that we want to build critical thinkers, problem solvers, communicators of the future. Communication is almost a useless term, right? Because employers say they want people who can communicate well, educators say they're creating great communicators. I can't go out onto the job market and say, I'm a great communicator, right? And someone hire me because they're looking for someone who can communicate well. There's no happy marriage that occurs there. So what we actually were able to do is show how that broad skill of communication actually manifested differently depending on the pathway that you took. And it turns out that there are 10 very promising pathways for liberal arts grads. They tend to move into PR, advertising. They tend to move into sales and management and financial services and behavioral health. There's these sorts of 10 different pathways that are magnetic for these liberal arts grads. And over time, you actually see how the skill of communication actually morphs into, like if you go into PR and advertising, it looks a whole lot more like search engine optimization and storytelling and brand management. These are the precise sorts of human plus skills that you develop. Whereas in behavioral health, it looks like crisis intervention or behavioral counseling, right? In HR, it's actually, you better be ready to write some HR handbooks and do some onboarding and create an LMS. So there are these sorts of, these broad, uniquely human skills actually then manifest into this thing that looks a whole lot more like human plus technical. So I think that is something that's exciting to think about, because we don't have to say to someone who's like passionate about pursuing the liberal arts, you should really think about STEM, right? Because we don't want to sort of think about how we are so direct about economic relevance. It turns out a liberal arts grad actually does really well in the workforce. They have positive outcomes. They ultimately escape the rut of underemployment by their third job. There are all kinds of really great things out there. We just don't tell our learners this information well. But now that we have access to real-time labor market information, this is where the opportunity lies. So I think that's the exciting thing to me, is that those who are going to pursue STEM skills, we should absolutely encourage them to do so. The earnings are great. The ROI is intense. It's phenomenal. They have great career trajectories. But for those who are really passionate about the liberal arts, we can actually explain to them, here's some things you should know before you start your experience, and here are some different kinds of work-based learning opportunities we can embed so that they can launch more successfully into that first good job.
So Dr. Wise will take just one more question. Okay.
I have the mic. I as the father of a 13-year-old daughter, I have seen firsthand the flaws of the traditional education. I try to give her, obviously, the best. I don't want to wait for some institution to be disruptive.
Yeah.
I want her to be disruptive. What is just the advice that you can give me as a single parent to introduce to her to be disruptive,
Yeah.
to introduce her to the future of work and all these opportunities that are rising right now for alternatives in education from right this moment, you know?
So part of it for our younger learners is for them also to understand that sort of three-part life is over of education, work, retirement, that they have to have a different sort of growth mindset of thinking about how they are continually going to have to return to learning over time. And it may not look like that traditional model. That's kind of one small piece. I think one of this is just top of mind because I'm reading the book right now, is a book by Cal Newport called So Good They Can't Ignore You, where he talks about sort of our skills like asset management. And actually the Institute for the Future in Palo Alto, California also talks about this, where the future is not going to be careers. It's not even going to be jobs. It's going to be this sort of asset management of the skills that we can produce for the labor market. And so how do we best market those sorts of skills? Because We know that certain kinds of labor is task-oriented, and some of those will be automated. How do we think about the ones that, you know, that are more resilient to that future of automation? So that's kind of one just sort of, again, different sort of mindset shift of like, oh, I went to college, I'm done for the rest of my life. Or maybe I'll get a master's degree later and I'll be set for life. It's just not going to be that simple. So to teach our learners that they are going to have to think more fluidly about this in the future, I think is critical. But yeah, I mean, I think it's a question for all of us right now, because we have to start building now. It may take a while. The good news is, again, with that $2.9 billion marketplace, is that there are lots of alternatives that are emerging that are quite phenomenal. And that's why I think it's worth, you know, keeping an eye on all of that innovation instead of dismissing it, because you never know. Like if we think about the value of higher education, it may be even more valuable after a little bit of time in the workforce, right? There are some incredible military colleges in the U.S. I visited the U.S. Naval War College in Rhode Island. Most of their learners are 35 years old and older because they've served in the Army for at least 8 years. So they're coming into their class on philosophy and learning about Heidegger and Kant, but using their real-world experience to understand these problems. So it makes it so much more poignant to them versus trying to understand as a young 17 or 18-year-old the value of some of this education. So there may be some opportunities with a lot of those burgeoning alternative providers to embed some interesting kind of work-based learning opportunities that help develop our learners before we maybe push them into a four-year experience. So I think there will be more alternatives, there will be more choice, I think, even for your 13-year-old. Thank you.
For those of you who are interested in today's presentation, it has been taped, recorded, and webcast live. Okay? We thank you for your attendance at the 8th International Symposium. A special thanks to our sponsors, Banco Santander, Claro de Puerto Rico, and Aerostar. We invite you to join us at the Chancellor's House, the beautiful blue house by the river, where the rest of the day's agenda will continue. Have a wonderful day and enjoy our beautiful campus.